Thank you so much for joining. This is Cass Sanford. I'm Associate General Counsel at OTC Markets Group. I'm filling in for our General Counsel, Dan Zinn, today, who usually MCs these presentations. I am very excited to have you all on to discuss the CAT Phase 2 quote and order reporting obligations. I'm really just going to turn it over to Chris Bach in a few to start getting into the details. But first, I'm going to just go over some small housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. And if you have any questions as we go through, the presentation will be around 30 or so minutes, and then we'll save some time for a question and answer period at the end. So if you have questions, please feel free to just enter those, type those into the chat. Everyone on is in listen only mode. So to engage with us, just open the chat box there in the webinar module and type in your questions, and we'll address those at the end. We'll try and get to as many of them as we can. And if we're unable to get to any, we will reach out to you after and address any unanswered questions. This presentation and a recording of the webinar will be made available for anyone that missed it or wants to go back and revisit. Finally, the information presented here is for informational purposes only and does not constitute any legal or compliance opinion of OTC Markets Group or Link. And with that, I will turn it over to our Chief Compliance Officer, Chris Bach, to get started on the fun stuff.
Thanks, Cass, and good afternoon. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Really, we're going to try to give a broad brush overview of the requirements specific to quotes in Phase 2D. And just give us a second. I'm flip through my slide. Sorry, we're having a slight technical difficulty flipping the slide.
There we go.
So as I was saying, we wanted to give a broad brush overview of what the specific requirements are in terms of reporting quote events in CAT Phase 2D. This is a first kind of reporting requirement specific to quotes, certainly OTC equity quotes, through any sort of persistent regulatory reporting infrastructure, really in the history of our market structure, especially from the quote sender side. So these requirements are relatively novel, and they are not necessarily intended to reflect what CAT is ultimately intended to capture, and that's the order event lifecycle data. As we'll discuss kind of implicitly throughout the presentation, the quote events are intended to link the trade event on the order side to the quoted security that the trade message was, in this case, directed to, just like the linkage construct in the NMS world. So with that in mind, we wanted to, again, provide a summary level scope of which quote events are going to be required from the perspective of the quoting participant or quote sender, specific to subscribers who make markets in OTC equity securities and quote on the IDQS, as well as provide kind of context in a relationship mapping between the quote events as our subscribers have understood in terms of the market structure and the tools and functionalities, as well as the naming conventions, and try to map that again at a high level to CAT events. So with that, I will move on to our an overview of the IDQS's functionality, just to try to provide some, again, additional context between OTC Link's quote-driven marketplace and the inherent CAT events that are really modeled off of order event lifecycle linkage requirements. So as you all know, we are a quote-driven IDQS. We are not an intermediary to any part of the trade. We don't match or execute orders. We don't facilitate any part of the transaction other than to provide the quoting technology, the IDQS itself, that subscribers can publish quotes in OTC equity securities, as well as trade message functionality that subscribers can leverage to send trade messages to negotiate trade and facilitate executions of published securities. This differs significantly from the NMS model, which is order-based. OTC Link ATS is the only quote-driven platform that does have CAT reporting requirements. So with that, there is, some significant deltas between terminology, messaging, and CAT event constructs that aren't organically mapped to quotes. I do think the CAT committee and the FINRA CAT technology team did do a good job of modeling those appropriately, which is why I think we do have a relatively event structure that mirrors the OTC Link IDQS market structure to the CAT order event lifecycle. One thing to note that is important, there is going to be a limitation in the scope of reportable quote events to only electronic quote events. And we'll talk about the distinguishing features between quote events that are electronic and those that are manual in a second, but only those that are electronic will be reportable until at least July 2023, as we currently understand it. And we also wanted to just note our internal concept of linkage being between the quote ID that is received by the IDQS persistent throughout the life cycle of the quote, so from quote add to quote cancel. So again, those are two concepts that I just wanted to highlight before going on to more of the specifics. So as I just mentioned, there's a distinguishing feature between the reportability of quote events reportable by OTC Link subscribers, and that is between manual quotes as defined by CAT and electronic quotes as defined by CAT. So it's relatively easy, include a number of definitional points, but really the idea is anything that is entered into the IDQS via OTC dealers front-end application that most of you know well, those are considered manual quotes pursuant to the specifications defined in manual systems in the same manner as OTC Link, or excuse me, OTC dealers design, as well as some additional FAQs and guidance, specifically FAQ B43, that provides some relief for manual quotes, at least in the near term, phase 2D scope. So anything entered via the dealer is manual. Anything not entered via the dealer is considered electronic. So there's only one option to send quotes to Link IDQS other than the dealer, and that is through fixed connectivity, connecting a front-end system, either a proprietary system or a vendor provided OMS that connects directly into the IDQS. So this slide, and we will send these slides some point after this call, do distinguish between the manual and electronic quotes, and what side is what side has a reporting obligation, if manual and if electronic. So with respect to manual quotes, so again, anything entered via OTC dealer, the new quote and the quote route event are not going to be reportable. Those are only reportable from the perspective of the quoting participant. So those are out. The quote status event, which we'll talk about a little bit later, would only be reportable by the receiving IDQS, which is us. Those will reflect open and closed traders messages. Quote canceled, again, not reportable by the quoting participant, reportable by OTC link, and same with quote received event. Quote received event will always be reportable only by OTC link and not the quoting participant. And then in contrast, we have the electronic quote scope for industry members, as well as the IDQS in phase 2D. Go live, so a new quote and quote route events, both reportable by the subscriber. I'm going to skip quote status for a second and go to quote canceled, both reportable, and then quote received again will always be reportable only by OTC link. The quote status is reportable at all times by OTC link. The quote status, we'll talk about this in a second, but that reflects a quote message sent to OTC link instructing a quote to be closed or opened on OTC link IDQS. The only time, whether manual or electronic, that the quoting participant is required to report a quote status event would be if the trader directs a trade message, or excuse me, a quote message directly to a specific quote and essentially points and clicks to a specific quote to open or close that quote. That should be a relatively infrequent workflow, but just wanted to note that that would be the only time the industry member who is not an IDQS would be expected to report a quote status event in 2D. So next, I just wanted to highlight some of the more specific CAT event attributes collating the event type itself to what the action is on the IDQS. So the new quote event conflates two different actions that are performed all the time by traders who transact and publish quotes on the IDQS. That being the quote add event, which reflects anytime a new quote is published for the first time on the IDQS. That's also the time that the IDQS assigns a quote ID that persists throughout the life cycle of the quote. And then quote updates, which are any changes to the size or price of the quote. Those can be as infrequent as days or weeks or even months, or it could be a very frequent occurrence, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times a day. Each one of those update events will be reported by a new quote event, which reflects the modification of that quote or update of that quote. So essentially the new quote event is used to model a modification event, which is the quote update, and a new event, which is the quote add. And they model that as such by keying into the quote ID concept. There is the expectation that any quote ID that is assigned would persist until canceled. Any modification prior to CAT receiving that cancellation event would be reflected as a modification or a cancel, depending upon whether or not the only one quote failed is populated, which in our case would be true at all times because of the structure of our marketplace, allowing only one quote to be published by a specific MPID and a specific security at one time. So the quote add events, and I might use the term quote add and new quote event at the same time, does have a number of data attributes. Just to point out kind of the role of the new quote event. The new quote event is always going to be intended to tie the received quote reflected on the IDQS that OTC link reports to the message that was sent to publish that quote. The materiality doesn't necessarily need to link the way it does on the order side, because as we'll discuss a little bit later, CAT will use the received quote ID to link to the trade event, which is the ultimate goal of quotes being published or sent to CAT in the first place. So really the key values here are the quote ID. That's not going to be dispositive in the linkage. The quote ID could theoretically be whatever the quote and subscriber wants it to be. The quote key date, the CAT reporter IMID symbol, and then the bid and ask values, the size and prices. Also included is the firm designated ID. That's going to be the account of the market maker's either market making account or omnibus account or some form of firm market making account for OTC securities in most cases. So the next use of the new quote event is to update quotes. So any quote update message that's sent electronically to OTC link will be reflected in a new quote event. Again, the materiality is not necessarily dispositive of really anything, so long as the new quote event, either the add or the update, would link to the quote received event that we report. Really, the way this works, or the way to look at it, is you're going to have a foundational event that starts the quote lifecycle. That's going to be the quote add. After the quote add is received, which will be reflected by the new order ID following the cancel, each subsequent update could reflect the same base quote that was sent, the quote add. That could be thousands, millions, or more updates until the quote is ultimately canceled. The life cycle stops at the cancel and will begin again specific to the same security if and when the subscriber sends a new quote add event. So the way we want to capture this activity would be the concept of persistence of the same order ID that OTC link ATS reports on their quote received event, which does not need to match with the quote ID that the sender sends throughout the entire life cycle, just like we would model it today, just like we do model it today, because we've had obligations to report the quote received event since the beginning of 2A. And any subsequent updates, whether it's 1 or whether it's 1 billion, would map to that same quote ID. Routed order IDs are essential only for the purpose of linkage between the new quote and the quote received event. It doesn't play any material place in any surveillance that CAT performs on the quote events. It only performs it's a singular value that CAT links the new quote and the quote received event to. We'll get into that a little bit later, but we just wanted to raise that because there is optionality for quoting participants to send whatever routed order ID they would like, but ultimately we do want to link. We do want consistency in the linkage, so we have a number of suggestions to make that happen. Next slide, we kind of discussed again high level the quote status event. The quote status event simply reflects the message sent to OTC link, opening or closing a quote. Again, that's only reportable by the industry member in the event that the industry member points and clicks to a specific quote that it wants to open or close. All other quote status events, open or close trader messages are out of scope for 2D from the perspective of the industry member. OTC link will report every quote open and every quote close via a quote status update. To reflect every single open and close event. So again, the scope of reportability by the industry member who is not an IDQS is just limited to singular point and click scenarios. And then the quote canceled event. So this is the terminal event for the quote lifecycle. The quote canceled event is reported by both the sender as well as the receiver. They do not have to link, but they will both map to the quote ID. It will map to the quote ID that is canceled. Once that occurs, the next event would be the genesis of the life cycle of the same security via quote add event, reflected in a new quote event. Material attributes here are the quote ID, so the quote ID being canceled, the quote ID that's being canceled by the receiver IDQS would be the original quote ID that was assigned, and then the initiator will always be firm. Just to clarify, if the cancel was initiated on behalf of a customer order, so security was quoted on behalf of a customer, we will still, and the subscriber would still use firm because of the riskless principal model. So the next slide talks through some of the concepts just discussed in terms of the matching between the routed quote ID and the received quote ID. So again, this identifier, which could theoretically be any identifier that meets CAT's character limits, can be reported as that field. In effect, all it's going to do is map the new quote event to the quote received event. The only materiality of the routed quote event is essentially create kind of a stateless event concept to reflect that one routed quote ID. So there's, again, no matching between any of the criteria between the received and the new event other than the routed quote ID. We do understand that there's different methodologies that firms have currently applied to their quote messaging systems. Again, here we're assuming that either a proprietary OMS or a vendor OMS is being used. And in order to capture, hopefully all of the possible use cases, we do have a number of options available. And again, just to go back, we do want to make clear that this, although there is the obligation to match, and the received event is always going to reflect the quote event, we do want to try to spur some consistency in how specific firms can report the routed quote ID event. And again, depending upon how your firm systems are modeled, what may work for one firm may not work for another. So what we, again, want to provide here are 4 options that would be available. If firms do have, on this call, do have systematic models that differ, we'd be interested in hearing if there's anything that we can do in terms of data that we can help support the linkage criteria in 2D. So the first option that would be made available would be for firms who have taken advantage of the Service Bureau functionality for the limited 2C obligation, reporting trade messages directed to ARCA, would be very similar in the generation of the new quote unquote route events. We would, in those cases, use the quote ID that OTC link assigns as the quote ID, would use the quote ID as a routed quote ID, as well as the received quote ID, so that there is consistency amongst all of the identifiers that would be persistent and can be restated throughout the entire life cycle of the quote. So we would default in a Service Bureau capacity to the quote ID we assign. In the first bullet, this assumes that the subscriber would entitle OTC link as a CAT submitter, and we would submit those files on your behalf at the end of the trading day directly. The second bullet is the same concept, except instead of sending the files directly to FINRA CAT on your firm's behalf, we would do so to your firm directly. We can do that via an SFTP push or through an email that has CSV files with the CAT events. Again, same concept as if we were submitting, we would use our order ID as the routed quote ID. We would use the order ID to reflect the routed quote ID as well as the received quote ID. Again, consistency throughout the quote lifecycle. For firms who do not intend to leverage OTC link as a service bureau or as a source to generate the new quote and routed quote events, we would we will have the ability to send our quote ID in fixed tag 9690, the message ref ID field on the quote acknowledgement message, I believe 331 on the fixed quote spec. Essentially there the subscriber would just pull fixed tag 9690, whatever value is included in that tag, and map that to their routed quote ID event, which we would then reflect in our quote received event. Next option, to support industry members who want to send us a value that is not our quote ID, we will implement fixed tag 9695. That's an open tag today. It's not currently in the specifications. That would be used only to it would be used only for the purposes of communicating or making available the routed quote ID that the subscriber would like OTC link to report on their quote received event. So again, that is additional optionality that would allow quoting participants to avoid either pulling the quote ID on the ACK message or would avoid having to entitle or receive records created by OTC link. One other concept related to the routed quote ID, so specific to how OTC link would model the new quote and routed quote, as well as a quote received event. There's a field within the CAT specs called the duplicate routed order ID conditional flag that borrows from the order side that allows the same routed order ID to be repeated on an order modification. That same concept is borrowed here. So any time a quote is modified or updated, the quote ID as well as the routed quote ID can persist throughout the entire quote lifecycle. So how we would model this from our perspective as a service bureau or as the generator of quote events for your firm would be to populate the routed quote ID within the routed quote ID event, the duplicate routed order ID conditional flag as true, which would allow the routed quote ID to persist or be restated throughout the entire life cycle of the quote. If that flag is not turned on, CAT will process duplicate routed order IDs reported between sender and receiver, same symbol, as a reject due to duplication. So again, that's how CAT has modeled the ability for firms to report quote updates or quote modifications persisting kind of in a stateless format throughout the entire life cycle, allowing the same routed quote ID, received quote ID to persist from the beginning to the end. For firms who do not elect to use OTC links routed quote ID or the service bureau functionality, if your firm would not restate the same quote ID, that would have to be reflected in the duplicate routed order ID conditional flag being set as false. The next slide is just going to try to bring some of this together in terms of why we are reporting quote events at all. And that's really because CAT contemplates full linkage between the origination of the order or trade message all the way through execution and allocation. So there's a need to, in the CAT world, to link the order event to the source of liquidity that was being executed or was executed against. So in the NMS world, orders sent to exchanges would not require any industry member to report the quote event. That would be reported either by the market maker in the form of an order, or by the exchange against their market data. But in our market structure, it's a little bit different, where we have specific entities, broker-dealers acting in a market-making capacity, publishing quotes in their own name. That's essentially providing liquidity for specific securities. They're similar to options market maker quotes. That source of liquidity performs a material function within the order life cycle event. So anytime there's a trade message sent, the sender and the receiver, which would always be taking OTC link outside of the matrix for now, the receiver would always be the liquidity provider outside of counter message scenarios. The quote sender outside of counter message scenarios would be the order sender. CAT will always look for the size and price details upon any trade event, any execution, but also they do view the price and size of the quote as material, even if the trade was not executed. So that's the source of why we are even having this discussion. They need the quote event to link to the trade event. So to do that, they've come to a decision that I think is beneficial to all parties. That is, there's no linkage that needs to be performed on the new quote event. The linkage between the quotes and the trade messages on the order side will be performed via an order route event that OTC link generates upon receipt of a trade message directed to a market maker. So essentially how that's going to work is broker-dealer A sends a trade message directed to market maker 1, a sell order of 100 shares of XYZ. They send a trade message directed to market maker 1. CAT models that initial trade message as being directed first to OTC link. OTC link accepts that trade message and then reroutes that order to market maker 1. When we are rerouting that trade message to market maker 1, we will populate our order route event with our quote ID that we assign to the published quote displayed on the ATS. So that's how the linkage is going to be performed. And I just want to emphasize that. So our quoting participants are clear that the linkage between, again, the trade event and the quote event is going to be performed just like on an exchange, or whether it's a NMS equity security or an option market maker quote would be performed by OTC Link ATS via, again, the population of the quote ID on the order route event. So that's, again, a high level kind of discussion of what the scope of 2D is. Again, we're really specific to electronic quotes. For now, manual quotes for the specifications and guidance are out of scope until at least July 2023. That reflects exemptive relief that was published November 12th. Electronic quotes would be fully reportable except for cases where the open or closed quote was directed to a specific quote, which would then be reportable by the industry member.
All right, I am taking over to see if there's any questions here. Thanks for going through all of that, Chris. Obviously, a lot of information was covered with respect to how we are processing all of the CAT reportable events. If there are specific questions as to how it relates to your firm and how you're using our systems and how this type of information would be reported, please feel free to enter them in the chat now. Let me just make sure I don't see any questions submitted at this moment, but you can also, if you have some time to digest a lot of this information, we'll provide the slides and you can reach out to us directly and email us with any questions that you have on the impact of these phase 2D considerations. Chris, where should people direct emails or questions?
We include some firm contact details, myself, Bart Kreselak, or just a general OTC link emailer, or if you have specific contacts that you would like to reach out to, I think we're all happy to accept any questions or speak more broadly.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, this presentation has been recorded and will be published and distributed to anyone who registered as well as those that attended today. Thanks very much. And we're looking forward to working with you all on this big project.
Thanks, guys.